Can the local municipality shut down factories in the Klang Valley? What are its consequences? The answer to that question is no. My name is GK Ganesan and this is GKtv. On the 15th of July, the Housing and Local Government Minister, Datuk Zuraida Kamaruddin, said that the federal government had delegated powers to local authorities to take any action against any company or any factory that do not follow SOPs. She was, of course, referring to the Local Government Act 1976 and its role in preventing the pandemic. Now, the law concerning the steps to be taken by the pandemic is controlled by an act called the Prevention and Control of Infectious Diseases Act 1988, the PCIDA. Zuraida said that local authorities can close factories down under the PCIDA and the Local Government Act. A day earlier, Selangor Executive Councillor for Local Government and Public Transportation, Mr. Sze Han, said that local authorities have no power to arbitrarily cancel, terminate or revoke licenses or permissions granted for factories to function in Selangor. So who's right? Well, my own understanding is, and this is only my opinion, the local authorities have no such power. Why is that? Well, it is because the power given to the government to shut down factories comes from two statutory sources, two parliamentary laws. The two sources are, first, the PCIDA, Prevention and Control of Infectious Diseases Act, remember? Section 18 of that act gives the federal government the power to shut down any premise if it is likely to lead to the outbreak or spread of, for example, COVID-19. Section 18 of the PCIDA requires an authorised officer to do what? To examine the premises and order the premises to be disinfected. So the factory closure must be only for one purpose, disinfection. How long does disinfection take? Months? Days? Of course, days. Not because some minister says so. The government proclaimed the emergency, if you recall, on the 11th of January 2021. At that time, the government thought that there was a continuing existence of a grave emergency threatening the security, the economic life and public order of the Federation, arising from the epidemic of infectious diseases. That's what it said in Section 2 of the Emergency Essential Powers Ordinance. Therefore, the government made new laws. The first was, as I mentioned earlier, the Emergency Special Powers Ordinance 2021. I'll call it the Emergency Ordinance. Under the Emergency Ordinance, the power to use national laws fell under Section 11. Under the PCIDA, remember, the Pandemic Act, which is a federal legislation, by the way, and not a state law, only the federal government could authorize certain officers to assist the federal government to carry out its duties. Now, these officers could be anyone, a health officer, a soldier, or a policeman. The next question we ought to ask ourselves is whether the emergency ordinance allows the local governments and the state governments to shut down factories. In my opinion, the answer is no. Why? Well, several reasons. First, because the emergency ordinance does not have any such provision. Second, under Section 18 of the PCIDA, remember the Pandemic Act, there is no power to close premises for the sake of closing. Nor is there any arbitrary power in any federal legislation to do so. But it is possible for the federal government to appoint officers from local government, from the Klang Municipal Council, for example, to help the federal government to exercise the government's powers, the federal government's powers in the PCIDA, and that comes under Section 5 of that Act. But that is a power under the PCIDA, not the power under the Local Government Act as our minister seems to think so. Third, under Section 6 of the Emergency Ordinance, any person authorised by the King has the power to issue directions under the PCIDA for 5 purposes. 1. For the treatment. 2. For the immunization. 3. For the isolation. 4. For the observation. Or 5. For surveillance. And that person has no power to close down a factory unless he wishes to what? Disinfect it. Fourth, because this is an emergency, the PCIDA knocks out any other relevant provision in the Local Government Act, and this is confirmed by Articles 75 and 76, Clause 4 of the Federal Constitution. Further, Section 18 of the Emergency Ordinance knocks out any law that is inconsistent with it. If the Local Government Act has provisions which are inconsistent with the PCIDA, the Pandemic Act, or the 2021 emergency laws, then the Local Government Act is knocked out. Fifth, as I said, under Article 75 of the Federal Constitution, if a state like, say, Selangor, or Negeri Sembilan, or Kelantan, or Kedah, makes laws against any of the provisions of the PCIDA, then Article 75 knocks out the state law. Now, it could be argued that it's a local government, for example, the Klang municipality, that gives permission for a factory to exist. But that is subject to Section 107 of the Local Government Act. That section says that the local authority may, at its discretion, grant or refuse to renew any license without assigning any reason for it. Quite apart from these unconstitutional words in Section 103, subsection 3 of the Local Government Act, any such discretion is very limited. If there is any inconsistency between 2 federal statutes, then the statute that deals with the subject matter of the problem or the issue or the mischief prevails. Here, the PCIDA, which deals with the law relating to the pandemic, if it contradicts a provision in the Local Government Act, then that provision in the Local Government Act falls down, end of story. Let's now deal with licensing provisions. A factory has to be licensed, right? If you want to open a factory, you need a municipality license. But note that a licensing provision is not the king of its own castle. There are clear regulations on how such licenses should be granted or revoked. For an example, so that we can understand it, licensing of trades, businesses and industries for the Federal Territory of Putrajaya, Bylaws 2016. These bylaws explain how trade licenses are to be revoked. These regulations create a notification procedure. If you want to revoke, you must give the other side a notification. An appeal procedure, allow the factory to appeal. And a hearing of grievances procedure, allowing the factory to come for a hearing. After all of which, if there is sufficient cause, only then can a state authority be allowed to revoke such a license. So, if there are closures of these factories, who bears these losses? When a business entity suffers loss, there is a drop in profits. When profits drop, what will happen? Taxes will be lower or cannot be paid. There is no money exchange for products and people lose the value of their services. Who bears the losses at the end of the day? It's a federal government, it's a state government, and it's a local government. But what is the argument from the other side, the government side? Well, the governments say that they are afraid that people will die because of the pandemic, that it was necessary to shut down these business enterprises and factories to save lives. Now, this is a very good argument, and I accept it. This is the reason why we've had the PCIDA for 33 years since 1988. All we need to do is to enforce the PCIDA as strictly as possible. And since we've had the PCIDA for 33 years, why did we need an emergency ordinance in the year 2021 in the first place? Is this emergency ordinance effective in combating the pandemic? Had the PCIDA, which is 33 years old, been enforced with greater urgency and intensity, we would never have had this pandemic expanding at the rate it is. The emergency was declared on the 11th of January 2021, if you recall. From that time up to now, the number of cases in the Klang Valley have not diminished. If anything, they have risen alarmingly. The emergency laws, in my opinion, have failed to prevent the spread of the pandemic. So, the emergency is not working, the PCIDA is not being enforced, and there have been more factory closures in the Klang Valley in the last few weeks than ever in the history of Malaysia. Now, the question is Zuraida also factually wrong? I think so. For Zuraida to make the statements she did is to defy the true circumstances on the ground. Think about the psychological factors. If you coop up millions of people in their Klang Valley homes, which is one of the busiest hubs of economy in the nation, what do? You create poverty. You create a dependent population. Dependent why? Dependent on handouts. You leave room for depression. You leave room for other unhealthy states of mind to grow. Therefore, shutting down factories is not very clever, I think. Factories are a representation of a community's energies and economic power. When the goods of the factories or services are sold, the community itself generates money for itself and taxes for the government. In my humble opinion, the law does not support the position taken by the Honourable Minister Zuraida. On how to prevent the pandemic, I propose to record another video. Until then, thank you very much. Subscribe, share this with all your friends, put it out in the social media and press like. Good night and thank you.